All right. Well, as you see, I've got my cup of coffee. I hope you've got yours. We have a rather lengthy lesson this morning, this afternoon, whatever time it is where you are. We are going through the book of Daniel. We have finished the first 6 chapters of Daniel. We are starting in the second half of the book now. And this is where the prophecy comes in. This is where Daniel becomes a prophetic book, prophesying future events rather than just telling current events. So grab your cup of coffee or your cup of tea, your water, whatever you prefer to keep you hydrated and keep you engaged in the lesson. And we are going to get started. We have finally reached the conclusion of the outline that we discussed a few weeks ago. We're going back to the prophecy about the age of the Gentiles. Now, remember, the age of the Gentiles is a period of history that God has planned for Israel and the world. And the age is marked by 3 kings, according to what we learned back in chapter 2. So first, it's a time for Israel to be scattered outside their land. That's happened. Secondly, their city, Jerusalem, will be under Gentile domination. That has happened. Thirdly, this age must continue until the Messiah's second coming. And at Christ's return, the Jewish nation will be returned to her place as the supreme nation on earth. Now, if this is a little confusing to you, if you're like, what is he talking about? Go back to our teaching from chapter 2 on this study to refresh your memory. It's going to be helpful for you because Daniel 7 takes the teaching of chapter 2 and expands it greatly. But by that token, understanding chapter 7 depends on a firm grasp of chapter 2. You remember when you were in school and you had to learn all of the stuff in chapter 2 in math or in science in order to understand chapter 3, because chapter 3 built on what you learned in chapter 2. So just as this outline that we talked about runs from chapters 2 to 7 would suggest, this is a continuation of those chapters. So let's set the scene for the events of chapter 7 by reading the opening passage. This is Daniel chapter 7, starting in verse 1. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and visions in his mind as he lay on his bed. Then he wrote the dream down and related the following summary of it all. Daniel said, I was looking in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and 4 beasts were coming up from the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion and had the wings of an eagle. I kept looking until its wings were plucked, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. A human mind was also given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, resembling a bear, and it was raised up on one side, and 3 ribs were in its mouth between its teeth. And thus they said to it, Arise, devour much meat. After this I kept looking, and behold, another one like a leopard, which had on its back 4 wings of a bird. The beast also had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. We're going to stop right there. So we're going back in time. Daniel dates this chapter to the first year of Belshazzar's reign as king of Babylon. Now remember, chapter 5 described how Belshazzar's reign came to an end. And then chapter 6 moved forward in time to the reign of the Medo-Persian king Darius. But now we're moving backward to the beginning of Belshazzar's reign. Now, history tells us that he reigned 14 years, so we've gone back about 15 years in time. And that timeline places Daniel in his mid-60s and still serving the king of Babylon. And at that time, he receives a troubling dream. And with it, he also receives a personal interpretation from an angel sent from the Lord. Now, this dream and its interpretation parallels the dream that God gave to Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2, but it adds some new important details. In fact, taken as a whole, this chapter reveals more detail about future events than any other chapter in the Old Testament. Let me say that again. Taken as a whole, this chapter reveals more detail about future events than any other chapter in the Old Testament. The only other place in the Bible comparable to this chapter is the book of Revelation. So the Lord is speaking to the final king of Babylon through Daniel in the same way he spoke to the first king of Babylon concerning the same subject. In verse 2, Daniel begins to describe his strange dream. It says, 4 winds were stirring up the great sea. Now, when we attempt to interpret symbols in prophetic passages, we have to be constrained by proper rules of interpretation. The meaning of symbols will always be given somewhere in the Bible. You don't just pluck them out of the air. So first, we consult the immediate context for an answer. If none is found, then we look elsewhere in the same book of Scripture for an explanation of the symbol. If still no answer is found, we look elsewhere in the Bible, but in all cases, we will find an answer given. So in this case, the Great Sea. In this particular case, the Great Sea is consistently a reference to the Mediterranean Sea, which was the greatest body of water in Israel's experience. In Scripture, the Mediterranean Sea is used symbolically to represent the population of the earth. It means the masses of humanity, but in particular, the Gentile nations of the earth. And this symbol is used this way in Isaiah and also in Jeremiah. And Jesus uses the sea symbolically in the same way in Matthew 13, Luke 21, and multiple times in the book of Revelation. So these 4 winds are stirring up the great sea. And the 4 winds is a reference to God's power over his creation. The Hebrew word for winds is a synonym for spirits. So we could translate verse 2 to say the 4 spirits were stirring up the sea. 4 winds are used symbolically in this way in multiple places in both the Old and the New Testament. You can look in Jeremiah, Zechariah, and also Revelation. So next, Daniel says 4 beasts emerged from the sea. Each beast was different from the other, and Daniel describes each beast's appearance. But before we look at each beast in turn, let's first note the similarity to our matching chapter, which is chapter 2. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of a statue with 4 sections. Those sections described a timeline of kingdoms, each one replacing the prior one. But that chapter told us virtually nothing about the nature of each kingdom. Now in this dream, we have 4 beasts, and we're going to see that these 4 animals correspond to the same 4 kingdoms from chapter 2. But beasts do not imply a timeline, as did the parts of the statue. Instead, the beasts emphasize the nature of each kingdom. So this dream confirms the earlier interpretation and adds important information about what to expect in each kingdom period. And most importantly, this chapter focuses our attention on the final stage of the 4th kingdom. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue was actually a dream of 5 kingdoms, not 4 kingdoms. At the conclusion of the 4th stage of the statue, a new kingdom was established from heaven. And as we learned in chapter 2, that final kingdom is the kingdom of Christ that he establishes at his second coming. Now, in chapter 7, we're going to learn important details about how the last kingdom comes to its end in preparation for the Lord's return. And naturally, that's our primary interest in this particular prophecy. The 4 kingdoms have already appeared in our history. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome have all come and gone. So as the world moves to the final period of the fourth kingdom, our interest naturally moves to how the age of the Gentiles ends, because that's the age we're in. So the prophecy in this chapter fills in a lot of those blanks. So at this point, we arrive at our interpretation of the sea and the wind and the beasts. Now, the Lord tells Daniel he will move among the Gentile nations of the world supernaturally to raise up 4 kingdoms. The first of these kingdoms is Babylon. We know that from chapter 2. That kingdom is pictured by a lion with the wings of an eagle. And at a point, the wings are plucked. And later, the beast is made to stand up like a man. And it says a man's mind is given to the beast. Now, as you would expect, all the details of this beast match the history of Babylon perfectly. First, the nation of Babylon used both a lion and an eagle as national symbols. In fact, statues have been found in Babylon of lions with wings. The beast's description matches Nebuchadnezzar's 7-year episode of exile. If you remember that, he had his authority and his honor removed by God. In other words, his wings were plucked. But later, Nebuchadnezzar was restored from living like a beast. He was returned to his position as king, and his right mind was returned to him in chapter 4. Next, Daniel describes the second beast as a bear raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth. Here again, the symbol matched the history of the Medo-Persian Empire that replaced the Babylonian Empire. In ancient Palestine, the bear was considered the second most fearsome predator after the lion. And the bear is a creature known for overpowering prey by its weight and its strength. The bear crushes and rips apart its prey. That was the military strategy of the Medo-Persian Empire. They amassed huge armies that defeated enemies by sheer strength and numbers. And as they conquered, they utterly destroyed their enemies with a vengeance. Furthermore, their empire arose out of 2 peoples, the Medes and the Persians, but it was not a union of equals. The Persians were by far the most powerful people, having a much larger empire and a superior army to the Medes. This is reflected in the bear leaning to one side. Heavenly voices told the bear to devour much meat, which means to conquer many nations. And the kingdom defeated 3 major adversaries in its rise to world domination. First, it defeated Babylon. Later, it conquered Lydian. Finally, it conquered Egypt. These 3 conquests are represented by the 3 ribs in the bear's mouth. Now, this empire ruled for 208 years, having conquered an area greater than even Babylon possessed. Now, next, Daniel describes a beast resembling a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings. This beast corresponds to the Greek Empire of Alexander the Great, which conquered the Medo-Persians. History reports that Alexander pointed to the book of Daniel in his day as proof that he was destined to conquer the world. So, taking confidence in Daniel's prediction, Alexander's armies moved swiftly from west to east, completing a victory in record time. In 3 years, Alexander conquered territory stretching from Greece to Africa to India, which reflects the swiftness of a leopard. Now, during Alexander's life, excuse me, he delegated governmental control over this vast territory to 4 divisions with a single governor in charge of each one. This division is represented by the 4 heads of the leopard. At Alexander's death, he had no heirs, so his empire was divided among his 4 generals in 4 geographical regions. There was an east, a west, a north, and a south division, which is represented by the 4 wings. Now, all these details track with history and with the earlier dream in chapter 2. They are also of little interest to us beyond simply confirming the accuracy of Daniel's prophecy. The real interest has always been with the fourth kingdom. Not only does the fourth kingdom receive the most attention, both in chapter 2 and here in chapter 7, but it's the most important historically, because this kingdom will be the one that ushers in the kingdom of Christ one day. So we are most interested in knowing how this kingdom will proceed over time, and in particular, how it ends. So since we know that we are currently living in the fourth kingdom period, then these details will naturally be very important to us. In fact, they speak of our own future, looking ahead to the end of this age. So then Daniel describes the next visions that he sees in his dream. Look in verse 7. After this, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrifying and extremely strong. And it had large iron teeth. It devoured and crushed and trampled down the remainder with its feet, and it was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. While I was contemplating the horns, behold, another horn, a little one, came up among them. And 3 of the first horns were pulled out by the roots before it. And behold, this horn possessed eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth uttering great boasts. Verse 9, I kept looking until thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames. Its wheels were a burning fire. A river of fire was flowing and coming out from before him. Thousands upon thousands were attending him, and myriads upon myriads were standing before him. The court sat, and the books were opened. Then I kept looking because of the sound of the boastful words which the horn was speaking. I kept looking until the beast was slain, and its body was destroyed and given to the burning fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but an extension of life was granted to them for an appointed period of time. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. Wow. The first thing we notice about Daniel's description of the fourth beast is his inability to compare it to any living creature today. In the case of the earlier beasts, Daniel drew comparisons to real-life animals, a lion, an eagle, a bear, a leopard. But in this case, there simply was no comparison possible. This beast was unlike anything else. It was dreadful and terrifying. And this detail alone piques our interest, which is what God intended. This creature was very strong, had iron teeth, and it trampled and crushed all the prior kingdoms. This beast corresponds to the fourth kingdom in the statue. And as with the earlier beasts, several details confirm our interpretation. First, the kingdom devours the prior kingdoms, confirming this kingdom is the one that follows the Greek Empire. Second, this beast has iron teeth, which reminds us of the iron legs of the fourth kingdom of the statue. Third, it has 10 horns. Now, we're going to look at these horns more closely in a minute. But already, we see a confirmation that this matches the fourth kingdom of the statue. In the statue, the fourth age ended with 10 toes. In chapter 2, the meaning of the 10 toes wasn't explained, but now the 10 horns in this dream will give opportunity for the Lord to explain. Now, speaking of the horns, we learn that from among the 10 horns, an 11th horn suddenly appears on the beast. And this horn was unique in that it had facial features of a man, and it was able to speak. It uttered great boasts, meaning it made audacious claims about itself. And it did violence to 3 of the other horns, resulting in only 7 remaining. Now, as we go on in verse 9, we see the end of all the beasts and the arrival of an entirely new kingdom. Now, once again, this detail matches the ending of the statue prophecy. In chapter 2, if you remember, the statue was destroyed by the arrival of the rock, not cut by human hands, and the rock represented Christ's second coming. Now, of course, the statue itself represents the age of the Gentiles. So we learned that the age of the Gentiles will end when the Lord returns to set up his kingdom on earth. Now we find a similar pattern in Daniel's dream. The 4 beasts represent the same 4 kingdoms of the age of the Gentiles. And now in verse 9, we see a description of Jesus' return and the kingdom. First, we're told that thrones were set up and the Ancient of Days took his seat. Now, that's a reference to God the Father. He's taken a seat in the sense of a judge preparing to pass judgment. His description is similar to the description that John gives us of the glorified Lord in Revelation 1. If you look at Revelation 1, verse 13, says, and in the middle of the lampstands, I saw one like a son of man, clothed in a robe reaching to the feet and girded across his chest with a golden sash. His head and his hair were white like white wool, like snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. Now, although one describes the Father and one describes the Son, nevertheless, the similar appearance of both is purposeful. Jesus appeared to John in Revelation to explain what events would bring the age to an end. Now, Daniel is receiving a dream describing very much the same thing. So these 2 moments are intended to be linked in our minds. So we have the similar description of both members of the Godhead. Now, around the Father was the court of heaven. His throne was ablaze, and a river of fire flowed around him. He was attended to by thousands and myriads, whether angels or others, we don't know. And with books being opened, it's clear that a judgment according to law is about to take place. So after the Father has sat down to judge, our attention is turned to events on earth where the Father's judgment is directed. First, the beast and his boasting horn is slain and destroyed, given over to a judgment of fire. This is a direct result of the Father's judgment in heaven. And this pattern of heavenly judgment followed by earthly consequences mirrors the events of Revelation. We're seeing that Daniel's vision is a preview of the events described in Revelation. In effect, Daniel 7 is a little revelation, describing the way the heavenly judgments of tribulation result in earthly destruction. Furthermore, not only is the 4th beast destroyed, but so are the remnants of the earlier beasts, so that all they represented was also taken away. Now, interestingly, before this judgment is concluded, this age is permitted to continue for a time. And we'll learn more about that time period a little bit later. But finally, as judgment comes against the Gentile kingdoms that rule during the age of the Gentiles, a new kingdom arises. And this new kingdom begins with the Son of Man coming from the clouds of heaven. Now, this reminds us of the rock coming out of heaven, and it confirms that the rock is Jesus. Daniel says in verse 13 that the Son of Man is presented before the Father before coming to earth to begin his rule. That scene is described in detail in Revelation 4 and 5. Look at Revelation 4, chapter 4, verse 1. After these things, I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I had heard, like the sound of a trumpet speaking with me, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things." Immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was standing in heaven, and one sitting on the throne. And he who was sitting was like a jasper stone and a sardius in appearance. and there was a rainbow around the throne like an emerald in appearance. I saw in the right hand of him who sat on the throne a book written inside and on the back, sealed up with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the book and to break its seals?" And no one in heaven or on the earth or under the earth was able to open the book or look into it. Then I began to weep greatly because no one was found worthy to open the book or to look into it. And one of the elders said to me, "Stop weeping. Behold, the Lion that is from the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has overcome so as to open the book and its 7 seals." Verse 9, and they sang a new song saying, "Worthy are you to take the book and to break its seals, for you were slain and purchased for God with your blood men from every tribe and tongue and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign upon the earth." Then I looked, and I heard the voice of many angels round the throne, and the living creatures and the elders, and the number of them was myriads of myriads and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and might and honor and glory and blessing." So notice the description of the scene. Myriads of angels attending to the Father on the throne, and the Son of God being presented before the Father and receiving the right to judge the world. And then finally, the Son being granted a kingdom on earth, having purchased the earth with his blood. Now, compare that description to the one we've got here in Daniel in verse 14. All the same features are present. People from every tribe, tongue, and nation serving Christ. The Son of Man presented before the Father. The Son granted a dominion, and Christ's dominion will last forever. There will never be another Gentile nation or any kingdom to take power away from Christ. And by the way, when Jesus referred to himself as Messiah in the Gospels, the title he used most often was Son of Man. That's found here in Daniel. Jesus uses the title 31 times in the book of Matthew alone. So it's almost like Jesus was emphasizing that he was the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. Jesus is the one coming to end the 4th kingdom. He's the one granted authority to rule over the world. So to this point in Daniel's dream, we see a consistent parallel with Daniel chapter 2. The 4 beasts represent the 4 kingdoms of the age of the Gentiles. The final kingdom is different from the rest. It possesses a unique and final stage involving the symbol 10, and it leads the world into the second coming of Christ. But we've also learned some new details. The symbol 10 is more complex than we saw in chapter 2. It involves an 11th that makes great claims about itself and contends with the other 10. And these things accompany a brief period of intense judgment poured out from God in heaven against the 4th kingdom. So obviously, there is still a lot of questions that we want and need answered, and Daniel feels the same way. So look at what he does next. Daniel chapter 7, verse 15. "As for me, Daniel, my spirit was distressed within me, and the visions in my mind kept alarming me. I approached one of those who were standing by and began asking him the exact meaning of all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. These great beasts, which are 4 in number, are 4 kings who will arise from the earth. But the saints of the highest one will receive the kingdom and possess the kingdom forever for all ages to come." So Daniel says his spirit was distressed at these visions for obvious reasons. Just as Nebuchadnezzar had been disturbed by his dream, Daniel was preoccupied in looking for answers to these visions. Now, it seems like when God sends messages by dreams, the receiver will always sense that the dream has some unique importance. And that may be a good rule of thumb for us to know if a dream is truly spiritually meaningful. Does the dream stick in your mind in a unique way? Do you feel compelled to understand it? If not, it's probably just too much pizza from the night before. But Daniel knows that this dream is important. In fact, even while he's still in his dream state, Daniel addresses a fellow observer in the dream visions asking for answers. Wouldn't it be nice to have someone in your dreams with you to explain why you went to school in only your underwear? I wondered about that for years. But anyway, in this case, the one who could interpret dreams needed an interpreter. Now, this little detail reminds us why the Lord works through interpreters. The kings of Babylon received visions, but they lacked answers. So when they received their answers supernaturally, they understood the dream had been a divine message. In like manner, even the prophet needed divine intervention to understand the message, which validated that it was from God. So in this case, we don't know the identity of the divine interpreter, but given what we see happening later in the book of Daniel, it's likely an angel. In the interpretation, we find confirmation of all the interpretations that we proposed in the earlier passage. First, the four beasts are four kingdoms, the same kingdoms as in chapter 2. The final kingdom is the kingdom of God that comes to rule the earth after the end of these four Gentile kingdoms. Again, no surprises there. But then Daniel had other things that he wanted to know, just like us. Look at verse 19. Then I desired to know the exact meaning of the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, and which devoured, crushed, and trampled down the remainder with its feet. And the meaning of the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, and before which 3 of them fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth uttering great boasts, and which was larger in appearance than its associates. I kept looking, and that horn was waging war with the saints and overpowering them, until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the highest one. And the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. So Daniel's attention was focused on the fourth beast because it was so different. It was so unique. Now, of course, God made it unique to draw Daniel's attention to it and draw our attention to it as well. But in particular, Daniel wanted to know about those horns and the 11th one. Now, Daniel gives us a little more detail about the boastful horn's behavior. He adds that this 11th horn is waging war against the saints. Now, a saint is not a special person above other believers. The term saint in Scripture is always a reference to any and all who belong to God. They're his children by faith, those who believe. We would say today that a saint would be those who are saved or those who are born again. So at the end of the age of the Gentiles, an 11th horn is trying to kill believers. And Daniel says the horn was overpowering them. That is, the horn was succeeding in killing believers. But the horn's power only lasted until the Ancient of Days passed judgment in favor of the saints. Now, interestingly, Daniel then says that the saints, the saved, the believers, including those who have been overpowered, were now taking possession of the earthly kingdom. So in other words, those who were killed by the 11th horn lived again. And in their living, they took back the kingdom that the fourth beast and his 11th horn had fought to obtain. So the 11th horn may have won a battle here or there, but he lost the war. The saints and their king, Jesus, will win in the end. So this now brings us to the heart of this chapter when the angel interprets the meaning of these new symbols for Daniel. Verse 23, thus he said, the fourth beast will be a fourth kingdom on the earth, which will be different from all the other kingdoms and will devour the whole earth and tread it down and crush it. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom, 10 kings will arise. and another will arise after them, and he will be different from the previous ones and will subdue 3 kings. He will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Highest One. And he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court will sit for judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, annihilated, and destroyed forever. Then the sovereignty, the dominion, and the greatness of all the kingdoms under the whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the Highest One. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all the dominions will serve and obey him. At this point, Daniel says the revelation ended. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts were greatly alarming me, and my face grew pale, but I kept the matter to myself. So the angel's interpretation fleshes out the last days of the 4th kingdom in remarkable detail. And as we're going to see, these details map perfectly to later prophecy given to the Apostle John in the book of Revelation. First, the angel says in verse 23 that the 4th kingdom is a different type of kingdom. It's different in comparison to the 3 that came before it. Again, that reminds us of the statue description from chapter 2. In chapter 2, Daniel told Nebuchadnezzar this. Chapter 2, verse 40, then there will be a 4th kingdom as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron crushes and shatters all things. So like iron that breaks in pieces, it will crush and break all these in pieces. In that you saw the feet and the toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it will be a divided kingdom, but it will have in it the toughness of iron, inasmuch as you saw the iron mixed with common clay. As the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery, so some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. So notice in this description, the 4th kingdom will consist of alliances being broken apart only to join back together in new ways. Now, when we studied this chapter, we concluded that the 4th kingdom was different than the first 3. It wasn't a monolithic government or empire. It began as the Roman Empire, which itself went through numerous phases over its existence, but eventually it broke up into pieces, which later recombined in various alliances. And even today, we see that pattern continuing. Just as the alliances have changed, so have the names that it calls itself. But in all cases, the 4th kingdom continues to exist and to exert its controlling authority over Jerusalem and the Jewish people. So now in Daniel 7, we see the angel confirming this pattern in verse 23. He says the kingdom is different from the rest. Don't try to find a single nation or government to represent the whole of this kingdom, because God has designed it to be different than the pattern that he established in the earlier 3 kingdoms. And that's one of the primary mistakes that interpreters make in trying to label the 4th kingdom in historical terms. The amillennialists, the amillennialists are those who don't believe in a literal 1,000-year kingdom of Christ on earth. They commonly make this mistake. They hold that the 4th kingdom was nothing more than Rome, so that once the Roman Empire disappeared, the age of the Gentiles ended. Therefore, this leads them to conclude that we must now be living in the promised kingdom. I hope not. This view is wrong for many reasons according to Scripture, but one reason is found here in Daniel. If we assign the 4th kingdom to the Roman Empire alone, then this kingdom can't be said to be truly different from the rest. In fact, it'd be very much like the rest. So the meaning of the angel's words in verse 23 and in Daniel in chapter 2 tell us to look for something unlike anything that's come before. Specifically, the 4th kingdom period may start with a monolithic power in Rome, but it doesn't end that way. After Rome, the 4th kingdom lives on, dividing and recombining into new alliances, and these alliances being formed from among the crushed pieces of the earlier kingdoms. This is exactly what we've seen in the centuries after Rome, and it continues today. Anybody heard of Brexit, European Union, all that stuff? Then in verse 24, the angel begins to explain the horns. Each horn represents a king, he says. And out of this fourth kingdom, 10 kings will arise. And these are the 10 horns that Daniel saw initially. Now notice, these 10 horns are contemporaries. They exist and rule all at the same time. All 10 are together, just as the statue in Daniel 2 ended with 10 toes lined up together. Also, remember that the statue was a timeline. So therefore, the toes represented the very end of the age of the Gentiles. Now we know that the 10 toes symbolize the 10 kings again. So this tells us that the 10 kings must come at the very end of the age, right before the Lord's return. We are living in the fourth kingdom now, and yet we don't see 10 rulers controlling the entire earth. In fact, we've never seen this come to pass at all during this kingdom period. So therefore, we know this prophecy still lies in our future. It hasn't happened yet. It's not historical, it's prophetical. Now, some, particularly the amillennialists, have interpreted the 10 kings as 10 successive Caesars of Rome. There are a lot of problems with this interpretation, but a key problem is that the symbol of 10 horns requires these kings rule at the same time. Again, the world has yet to see 10 world rulers during the time of the fourth kingdom. So this has to be an unfulfilled prophecy. The angel continues in verse 24 to explain the meaning of the strange 11th horn. Now, this extra horn is also a ruler, as the symbol suggests, but he's not like the rest. And we wonder in what way he's different, and we get more detail in chapters 9 and 11. We also get details in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Revelation. But for now, the angel says this horn will subdue 3 of the existing kings. This detail confirms that the 10 kings must be contemporaries, since 3 are being deposed by the 11th. And that word subdue could have been translated humbled. These kings are brought low. They're taken out of power. Apparently, the 11th king doesn't need to humble the other 7, since presumably they don't oppose him. Now, once the 11th king has consolidated his power, he begins to go to war against God himself and the saints of God, that is, believers. During this time, he will intend or try to make changes to times and to law. Now, these statements are obscure, being by themselves, so we can only propose possibilities here. A change in time suggests a change to our calendar. Remember, our calendar is centered on the first coming of Christ, so it makes sense that someone who opposes God would seek to change a calendar that honors his son. A change in law could be almost anything, but considering what we know, it seems to relate to opposing the saints. Maybe he outlaws worship of Christ. Maybe he determines that those who are professing Christians are to be executed. We're going to see confirmation of that in Revelation. But then the angel says this king will have his way on earth for a period of time, specifically a time, times, and half a time. Now, this phrase is well known if you are a student of prophecy, especially in the book of Revelation. It's a simple arithmetic equation. The word time represents the number 1. The word times represents the number 2. It's the plural of time. And then half a time represents 0.5, 1/2. So the phrase could be written 1 plus 2 plus 0.5, which equals 3.5. Now, later on in the book of Revelation, which describes this same period of time, we come to learn that this phrase describes 3.5 years of time. So the 11th horn reigns over the earth, persecuting the saints, opposing God for 3.5 years. Now, this is what Daniel meant earlier when he said the kingdom was granted an extension of life for a brief time. The Ancient of Days has already sat for judgment, and the sentence has been decreed. But for a short time, this king is allowed to continue, though his fate has already been fixed, though his judgment is sure. So the final thing the angel describes is that coming judgment and the kingdom to follow. In verse 26, the angel says the court sits for judgment, and the 11th king's dominion is taken away, and he is destroyed forever. And in his place, the rule of the whole world is handed over to the saints and the people of the Most High. We will live in this kingdom with our king. We will serve him. We will obey him. Before we leave this chapter, let's compare what we've learned in Daniel 7 to a passage from Revelation 13. In Revelation 13, we're told about a coming world ruler called the Beast, who will conquer the entire earth. Revelation 13, verse 1. Word of God says, "And the dragon stood on the sand of the seashore. Then I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads. And on his horns were 10 diadems, and on his heads were blasphemous names. And the beast which I saw was like a leopard, and his feet were like those of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his throne and great authority. I saw one of his heads as if it had been slain, and his fatal wound was healed. And the whole earth was amazed and followed after the beast. They worshiped the dragon because he gave his authority to the beast, and they worshiped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast, and who is able to wage war with him?' There was given him a mouth speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him." So this beast of a man is described as having 10 horns with 10 crowns. And notice, where did he come from? He came up from the sea again, just like the beasts of Daniel 7. And notice this particular beast is constructed of parts of all 4 beasts from Daniel 7. He had 10 horns on which sit 10 crowns. He clearly, these details are intended to connect Daniel 7 to Revelation 13. But then at some point, this leader is killed, and yet after a time, his quote unquote fatal wound is healed. So in other words, he's resurrected. As a result of his miraculous resurrection, the world is amazed and begins to follow this man, thinking him all powerful. So after this event, he starts to arrogantly boast. And finally, notice, he has his time in the spotlight for 42 months, which happens to be 3.5 years. All these details confirm that this man is the 11th horn of Daniel 7. He's coming into power in the final 3.5 years of the 4th kingdom, which is also the final 3.5 years before Christ's return. He goes by many names in the Bible, including the 11th horn and the beast. In chapter 9 of Daniel, we'll call him the prince to come. Paul calls him the son of destruction and the man of lawlessness. And John labels him the son of perdition, and most famously of all, the Antichrist. He rules the entire world for the final half of a 7-year period called the tribulation. And he's able to gain rule over the world by defeating the 10 kings that rule in his day. And by his miraculous resurrection, he convinces the world he is the Christ, that he is God himself. Now, this is the boastful thing he claims, the arrogant blasphemy he commits. How is he able to do these things? In Revelation 13:2, we're told that the dragon gave his power to the beast, enabling him to resurrect and command the world's obedience. So Revelation 12 tells us that this dragon is Satan himself. He brings this man to power, and through a coup, he takes control of the 10 kings. And Daniel says he humbles 3 of the 10, Revelation says he is killed and then resurrected at the midpoint of the tribulation. So it would seem then that in an effort to gain control of the world, 3 of the 10 conspire to kill the 11th man. And they succeed in killing him, only to see him return to life by the power of Satan. So at that point, the beast uproots these 3 kings while the other 7 fall in line. Revelation 17 explains it this way in verse 12: the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but they receive authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. Verse 13, these have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. So the 10 toes of Daniel 2 and the 10 horns of Daniel 7 both point to a confederacy of 10 kings that rule the world. Now, Revelation confirms that these men rule at the same time in history, at a point in the future shortly before Christ's return. They exist for the purpose of enabling the Antichrist to rise when they may give their power to him. And that's the final state of the 4th kingdom. So, therefore, we know that the second coming of Christ can't happen tomorrow, because that event depends on several things happening first, beginning with the emergence of 10 world rulers in place of the hundreds that we have today. Later on, an 11th man has to appear. That's the Antichrist. Then he has to gain full power for 42 months or 3.5 years. Only then can Christ return, according to Daniel. In fact, we can precisely date the return of Christ. It will be exactly 42 months, 3.5 years after the Antichrist gains control of the entire world. Now, some might wonder about Christ's words that no one will know the day and the hour of his coming, and not even the angels or the Son himself. That statement comes from Matthew 24:36 in the Olivet Discourse. When Jesus spoke those words, he wasn't referring to his second coming. He was referring to the rapture of his bride, the church. The moment Christ returns to claim the church and remove us from the earth is a moment that has no warnings, no prerequisite. We cannot know that moment, nor does even the Son. It is a moment chosen by the Father alone. But Christ's second coming to earth to establish his kingdom is a date dependent on a series of other events which Daniel and Revelation describe. So now, at the end of our little outline, we have a clear understanding of the age of the Gentiles. It's a period that God brought to pass judgment against his own people. It'll be many centuries of Gentiles ruling over Israel. It's marked by 4 major empires. Daniel saw the arrival of the first 2. We are now living near the end of the 4th. And despite subjecting Israel to this age of the Gentiles, the Lord hasn't forgotten them. He will continue to act to preserve a remnant among Israel. When they are persecuted by Gentiles, the Lord will be their strength. And Daniel and his friends experienced this lesson personally. Now, in closing, the fact that Gentile rulers have control over Israel doesn't mean they act with impunity. God himself retains his sovereignty over every ruler on earth, so that even as Gentiles will command Israel, God will command them. And that is a final assurance to Israel that God is not moving to destroy them, but to discipline them. And as he does that, he is able to extend mercy to Gentiles as well. So that concludes Daniel chapter 7. If you got lost, go back, re-listen to it again. Listen to the teaching on Daniel chapter 2. It's going to get more detailed and more prophetic as we go through the end of the book of Daniel. So don't try to go forward if you're lost. Go back and review what we've already talked about. Folks, I hope you're enjoying this. It's going to get exciting, and I am excited to take you on this journey and to experience the journey for myself. Until we meet again here on Teacher Talk, may God bless.